Good morning and welcome to the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Dr. Paul is traveling again today, so we'll deal with some topics together. Today, really, the topic we're going to discuss is the breaking, I would say, developing real scandal, which we would call Obamagate. This has to do with the setting up of a CIA task force to surveil the candidacy, to surveil those working for candidate Trump and on to President-elect and President Trump. Thankfully, to sort out a lot of these, arcane intelligence community, intelligence agency aspects of it, I have my good friend Phil Giraldi joining me today, and we're going to look at some of the things that are being written about it, not on the mainstream media, by the way, but are being written about it, some questions that are being asked, and some really potentially very, very grave conclusions that could be drawn from this. So Phil, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me on again.
Well, we both read some pieces by Larry Johnson, former colleague of yours in the CIA, a friend of ours, spoke at our conference, and there's been other writing about it. But he first reported that John Brennan, then CIA director, had set up a task force, CIA task force, in early 2016. And there's a specific meaning of what the word task force is in the CIA. And I thought maybe we could start out by just explaining some of the terminology. Phil, what is a task force? What is its purpose?
Well, a task force, as opposed to other operations that the agency runs, is basically I think you might describe it as a multi-force vehicle to go after a specific issue or a specific target. It has a legal definition in terms of how it's structured, but I think the important thing to note about it is that it also is empowered to draw in other elements from the national security and intelligence communities. And in a case like this, where a task force is being set up to investigate a foreign connection with an American or group of Americans, you would have had representatives of the FBI sitting in there. We would have NSA people sitting in there. You would have CIA analysts sitting in there, and also CIA case officers who were experienced in operating overseas. So you have quite a potent mixture of people with many different capabilities. NSA could tap phones, FBI could do domestic investigations, CIA analysts could tie all the material together, and CIA foreign operatives could go to foreign intelligence services to get their information on the target.
Well, just generically speaking, Phil, what would they set up a CIA task force for in the past? What sort of a thing would we need a task force to handle this?
Well, for example, the Iranian alleged nuclear program would have been handled through a task force. That would be one perfect example. There might be other issues where you have foreign suspected proliferation, and that would also attract a task force. It tends to be something where there are both domestic, foreign, and transnational implications. So you have a task force that brings together all of these resources.
Okay, and an important component that also, if you don't mind explaining, because I think it's really important, this was a hand-picked group, of course, picked by Brennan and Clapper, I think, as well, but primarily by Brennan. But it also relied, and you alluded to this earlier, Phil, it also relied on allied foreign intelligence organizations such as MI6, the Australians, the Italians, the Israelis. This is what Larry Johnson wrote. Why would they reach out to foreign intelligence agencies to work on this task force?
Well, there are a couple of obvious reasons. The one obvious reason would be that foreign intelligence agencies would have access to sources of information that the U.S. might not have. But the big reason, of course, is that the CIA in particular is not supposed to be operating against Americans. Now, there are waivers that permit that to happen on occasion, but the fact is it's a general rule, and it's a rule that really is usually observed. So the big reason to go to, say, the British to get information on Donald Trump or on some other American would be because the British could do the investigation legally, and the United States, there certainly would be questions raised if they were doing it or any U.S. entity were doing it.
So it's kind of like information laundering, really. You go through a different source so you can be protected. Well, according to Johnson, the task force was set up. Originally, it was justified as a counterintelligence operation because, of course, President Trump is a tool of Vladimir Putin. So that was sold as a counterintelligence operation. According to Johnson, it went beyond just intelligence collection and over to even covert action against the campaign and the president-elect, entrapping Michael Flynn, the first national security advisor, ensnaring, according to Johnson, George Papadopoulos, and that's an important component, I think. Developing Ukraine intelligence to be used against Paul Manafort. They needed scalps, and they were producing scalps, and it makes me wonder about someone like Maria Butina, who happened to be caught in the crossfire, whether she wasn't a necessary scalp that they needed to drive this narrative that somehow the Russians were deeply involved. What do you think about that, Phil?
Well, what I think is that this is the interesting aspect of it, that this was a Russian thing right from the beginning. And basically, as far as I'm concerned, it was a fabrication right from the beginning. Russia was the obvious choice of a country that you would want to use as being a corrupter of American politicians. So it's pretty obvious why you would do that. But the fact is, as we have discovered in the Mueller investigation, there is a little bit of smoke, but not much fire. And we have seen that essentially this whole the allegations of Russian meddling in the election don't, in my experience as a CIA case officer who has meddled in numerous elections in Europe personally and in the Middle East, I assure you that what Russia has been charged with does not go beyond the usual activity of intelligence agencies of all kinds. They all do this kind of thing, probing and going after sources of information and spreading articles that are favorable to their point of view. This is normal routine service of what intelligence agencies are expected to do. So anyway, there's that element to it. But it's interesting that Russia was kind of set up. And in a way, you could say that this is where Russiagate came from.
Mm-hmm. Well, Phil, surely you're not suggesting that the U.S. interferes in the elections of other countries overseas, are you?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think because we are the leaders of the free world, we have a right to interfere in other countries.
It's only for their own good. But yes, I think one of the key things, and you talk about the origin of Russiagate, and supposedly we have a task force of sorts set up by Attorney General Barr, including Prosecutor Dunham, who's looking into the origins of Russiagate. And let's hope, I'm afraid some hope is misplaced, but let's hope he actually does come to the bottom. But for me, the whole core of the Russiagate, aside from the setting up of this task force, is the 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment. Not an NIE, not an official product of the intelligence community, but sort of a cooked up new product, kind of a new Coke of the intelligence community. And it's fascinating because you remember this, Phil, it was released in January of 2017, this assessment, and it was sold as the final word on Russian meddling. All 17 intelligence agencies concur, agree, this is a product, a joint product. And here's what it said, and I know you read it many times, I did too. Russian interference in the elections directly ordered by Putin. The GRU, Russian military intelligence, used Guccifer 2.0 to disseminate the DNC emails and undermine our electoral process by showing how the DNC was cheating on the elections. That Putin wanted Trump directly. That RT was actively collaborating with WikiLeaks. And that RT and Sputnik were actively working to get Trump elected, reporting negatively on the Clinton Foundation. How could they do that? But the big part, more seriously, was the RT. And I'd like to focus on two things, actually. The RT thing and the Internet Research Agency thing just in this next segment, because the RT was big because this led to them being forced to register as agents of a foreign power, which no other state funded, as I understand it, in the U.S. No other state-funded foreign news agency is required to. Maybe Al Jazeera, I don't recall exactly. But this was the big explosion on RT. How dare they talk about the Clinton Foundation? How dare they talk about it? But the thing, Phil, when you look at who they had on, it was people like me and you, and a lot of other people who are Americans talking and voicing concerns about our government, about our foreign policy. This wasn't Russian mouthpieces. These were Americans that were not allowed on the mainstream media. So talk a little bit about the RT component, because I think it was important in the assessment.
Yeah, RT was, as you know, you and I have been on it numerous times. We have, I speak for myself, but I'm sure it's true of you also. I have never been coached on what to say,
No.
Or what position to take when I've been on RT, which makes it has made it for me a lot more comfortable fit than the few times I've been on CNN or Fox News. And this is another put-up job. Al Jazeera indeed is registered as a foreign agent, but RT was clearly selected and punished on a basis of nothing, on the fact that they had American critics of the two parties and of our foreign policy by and large and that was not acceptable to the deep state or the establishment.
Yeah, it's yeah. So the Internet Research Agency is the other big part, I think, because that had to be the bogeyman. That had to be the big thing. That's how the whole thing happened. Putin set up the Internet Research Agency to put ads on Facebook of Jesus fighting with Hillary. It made Americans go crazy and vote for Trump. That's really the story, I guess. But it didn't work. It didn't really work out that way, even though the report itself claimed ties to Russian intelligence services. It didn't explicitly make the connection. It was inferred. What about the role of this demonization of the Internet Research Agency as an agent of Putin in the intelligence assessment?
Well, the alternative view of the Internet Agency was that it was largely a commercial effort, and I think there's a lot of credibility to that. Again, this definitive report that was put out in 2017 basically was real light on evidence. It was real heavy on implications, and of course we always come back to the Steele Dossier, which was a source of information that went into that report and went into all the assessments that were made in 2016 by this task force and by all the other people who became activists in terms of looking for a Russian role in the election.
And that itself, of course, has been widely discredited. It's like if you bake a cake and you substitute salt for sugar. Doesn't matter what else you do, the cake is not going to taste good. It's not going to be a good cake, and it seems like that's what they did, relying so heavily on the Steele Dossier. But the interesting thing about the Internet Research Agency, and I think probably a lot of our viewers are aware of this, but it really bears repeating, is the role of Judge Dabney Friedrich, who was adjudicating the case against the company Concord Management Services. This is the company that was indicted by Mueller, and none of the indicted people or companies were supposed to show up to defend themselves. But Concord said, "Okay, we'll take the bait. We want to hear we want some discovery. We want to see what you've got. We want to challenge this in court." And of course, Mueller had a panic attack, and they were looking for stays. They were looking for extensions. But Friedrich didn't allow it. And not only did she not allow it, but on the Concord management case, she castigated Mueller's team for talking about Concord as an agent of the Russian government. She said you cannot conflate the actions of particular Russians or Russian companies with the Russian government. And she even threatened the Mueller team with contempt if they continue to do it. I think that is such a key component, Phil, don't you, of this whole thing, how it imploded.
Yeah, I think, again, we keep coming back to the same point, which is that essentially that our system of of accountability, I think maybe it's the best word to describe it, in government has been completely broken. The Every time one of these claims is made, we come back to the same thing, which is that there's no particular evidence to support the claim. I think you may have written the article, or I may have written the article, where we said we reached the point where if one of us were on the street and met a Russian and shook hands with him, we'd be in trouble. We've come to that point where the demonization in the mainstream media, in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, they begin every article discussing this issue with when Russia interfered in the 2016 election.
Yeah, when?
And of course, that's not been demonstrated. It's frightening, and the same process is going on now for 2020. We're learning that, oh yes, we're not threatened yet. They haven't actually lowered the boom yet, but it's coming. It's coming, and of course, this is the worst kind of fear mongering, and essentially, it is completely dishonest.
It's setting it up for challenging the outcome if Trump wins a second term. I mean, this is very familiar to me. I spent a lot of time monitoring elections overseas, and always when there was a U.S.-backed candidate, most often that candidate lost. But they wanted to prepare the ground for his loss or her loss, and it was always talking about the process was cooked from the beginning, so that when the other candidate, I'm thinking of places like Slovakia in '98 and Armenia in '98. It was always, it was cooked from the beginning. Sounds like that's what they're setting up. Interesting about the day that the assessment was released, there was a briefing of President-elect Trump. They came in and they sat and they briefed him. Who was it? It was Brennan. It was Comey, the FBI director, the NSA director, Mike Rogers, Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. These are the rogues gallery, really, of the task force. They came to brief, quote unquote, President Trump on this assessment. To me, in retrospect, with all we know now, it almost kind of feels like a warning or even a kind of a blackmail or something on the president. Can you imagine what that briefing was like? And what do you think the purpose was, really?
Well, I think probably the purpose was indeed the fact that Trump got elected surprised them, obviously, and this was a warning to him that they're quite capable of making things difficult for him. I'm sure that's what it was all about. But I think the other issue that is being not really discussed very much yet is the fact when this task force was set up early in 2016, and basically, I mean, the function of it was, let's face it, illegal, in that they were contriving mechanisms using foreign intelligence services to basically denigrate an American and disrupt the electoral process. That's exactly what they were doing. My question is, did Brennan do this on his own, or did the President of the United States, Barack Obama, know about this? And that's a question I would like to see that the Attorney General digging into, because this was we're talking about Trump and all the terrible things that he's alleged to have done, but the fact is this, by comparison, is a much more grave attack on the Constitution.
That's a great point, Phil, and it brings us back around to our title, which I guess we eventually always get back around to, and that is Saint Barack Obama, the patron saint of the Democrats. How much was he involved? How much could he have been involved? You've been in the intelligence world, for your career. Paint a scenario for us that you think might be more or less realistic.
Well, I have talked to a number of former colleagues who, some of whom know Brennan very well. And they are all in agreement that Brennan is not a big risk taker, that Brennan would not have set up this task force on his own to do this to a possible Republican Party presidential candidate. They all believe that this was something that was thoroughly vetted in the White House by the president, by Susan Rice, by the Attorney General, and they were in the loop right from the beginning. So that's just a subjective judgment based on Brennan, his personality, but it makes sense. it makes sense that Brennan would not go out on a limb and then cut the limb off behind him. And I would think it's something that we want to pursue over the next few weeks, and hopefully some more will come out on it.
There's a lot of interesting things in that comment, Phil. One is Susan Rice, who, along with Ambassador Samantha Power, were involved in another scandal that you don't really hear about, which is the massive amount of unmaskings of Americans who were surveilled, and this happened in 2016. There was a big uptick in unmaskings at the behest of Rice and Power. When Power was asked about it, she at first said, "No, there's no such thing." And then they said, "Well, look here. This is how many you did in this period versus before." And she said, "Well, it may have been done under my name, but I didn't do it." This seems to suggest that there was a massive surveillance of Trump's campaign team just looking for things, fishing for things. We're getting close to our closing, but I don't think we can ignore the unmasking issue.
No, I don't think we should. I mean, there's a whole pattern of illegality under the Obama administration, which people would choose to forget now that he's been beatified. And I think this is unfortunate. The guy was the one who started the assassinations by drone of American citizens. There are a lot of things that they would want us to forget. And I would also add to that list of names I just gave out, of course, Hillary Clinton would be right in the middle there too.
Yeah.
Secretary of State. So, let's let the die fall where it will, and let's see what level of corruption the Democrats are responsible for.
That's right, and it's up to us really, because the mainstream media is not going to be too keen, and even the so-called right-leaning media, they're cowed by this whole thing too, because they're afraid of being demonized as Russian sympathizer. You establish the narrative that if you don't want to go to war with Russia, you're some kind of horrible commie. So we don't really have any allies at all. But thanks to you, Phil, for a lot of your writing in places like UNS, everywhere that you write, the American Herald Tribune and elsewhere, we're able to follow in the alternative, the independent media, at least while we still can. And certainly on the Liberty Report, we're able to talk about it still. But I think, in closing, and I still want to get one more reaction from you, Phil, if you don't mind, is that a lot of this seems to be about Ukraine. There was a panic in the intelligence community that this wonderful masterpiece called the coup against the Ukrainian government in 2014 was about to be undone by President Trump, who said, "Why don't we get along with Russia? What's the big deal?" It's not super enthused about continuing the support of the Ukrainian government, probably not through any virtuous foreign policy philosophy of his own, but just not super enthused about it. Because so now we're having people come out, like the alleged whistleblower, Charella, who was a Ukraine guy at the NSC staff. We have Alexander Vindman, who born in Ukraine, and he even in his own testimony said that he was worried that the president was undermining our national security by withholding offensive weapons from Ukraine to fight with Russia. I mean, what the hell is going on with these guys who are under the president, thinking that somehow they were elected to conduct U.S. foreign policy? Somehow it seems that Ukraine was the key, and that's what threw everyone in a panic.
Yeah, Ukraine keeps popping up in this story, and of course, again, that's something that occurred under Obama.
Yeah.
And so it's again like there's a web of deceit going on, which is bipartisan. But the fact that the media and the chattering class in the United States has essentially been wanting to see this as a Russian issue, it shows how effective they've been at deflecting it away from the reality that you and I are seeing. When Ukraine comes up, Ukraine, how does it keep coming up? Well, it was a $5 billion investment by the United States to overthrow the government there. So it's again, let's really look at these issues. There's only one politician running for office that even talks about this, and that's Tulsi Gabbard. And she is being demonized as much as they are capable of doing.
Yeah, and Hillary's doing a job with that. She actually did her a favor, told she should send her a thank you note. Well, we're watching it closely, and we're watching what happens. We're watching how it plays out, and it is very important. This is what happens when you embrace a foreign policy of interventionism. It comes back to haunt you. Phil, I can't thank you enough for adding your really important insights to this. And I also can't thank our audience enough for joining us, many of you on a daily basis, and watching and commenting on and telling your friends about the Ron Paul Liberty Report. So thanks very much. Please come back and see us soon.
Thank you.